in the restless streets of Athens, where neon lights blur into the night air and the hum of traffic never stops, there was a man behind the wheel. To anyone passing by, he looked like any other taxi driver, stopping for passengers, weaving through narrow roads, carrying strangers from one side of the city to the other. But behind the steering wheel, and deep inside his mind, another story was unfolding. A story of quiet rage, of debts that could never be repaid, and of secrets no passenger would ever suspect. They would climb into his cab, chatting about their day, never realizing that the man in front of them carried memories he could not escape. Memories carved in fire, in blood, and in silence. Some people said he was just unlucky. Others whispered he had a temper that could burn through steel. But no one knew the truth. No one knew how far he would go, or how many roads would end in darkness. You are listening to Sleeping Radio. Tonight, we follow the winding path of Dimitris Vakrinos, the man the press would later call the angry taxi driver, a man whose journey begins like any other, but ends in a way you could never imagine. Athens, 1996. The city never truly sleeps. Even in the early hours, the hum of traffic clings to the streets like the scent of roasted coffee drifting from a late-night cafe. Neon lights shimmer on rain-dark asphalt, and the air is warm enough to carry the faint echo of voices from somewhere blocks away. Under a flickering street lamp on a narrow road in Kallithea, a yellow taxi idled, its meter dark, the engine a low, steady hum. Behind the wheel sat a man in his mid-30s, his posture calm, his eyes alert, as if he were listening for something beyond the city's restless tide. To the casual passer-by, he was just another driver waiting for the next fare. But he knew these streets better than most, not from maps, but from years of repetition, from muscle memory, from the small, unspoken patterns that made Athens a living thing. Every corner had its own rhythm. Every alley had its own shadow, and every traffic light, red, amber, green, was a kind of permission slip he could read instinctively. Passengers came and went. Some filled the car with laughter, others with the quiet weight of exhaustion. They asked for destinations, sometimes small talk, sometimes silence. He answered sparingly, his voice steady, almost soothing, the kind of tone that put people at ease. The calm of the engine, the calm of a smooth turn taken without hesitation. But beneath that calm was something else, something older. Years earlier, in a small mountain town far from Athens, he'd learned the value of silence. Born in 1962 in the rural heart of Arcadia, he grew up in a house where winters could bite through spring, and the walls seemed thinner on nights when tempers rose. His father was a man of drink and sudden anger, and in that cramped space, the boy learned how to shrink himself, to become smaller than the shadow of the storm. It was a survival skill, one that turned into an art. He noticed things others missed. the twitch in a man's hand before a punch, the pause before an insult, the subtle shift of a door left ajar when someone hoped they wouldn't be followed. Later, when he moved to Athens in his 20s, those instincts became part of his work. Now, sitting in the taxi, he still collected these cues without effort. The way a passenger's voice tightened when they weren't sure of the address, the shared silence between a couple who had run out of words, the glance in the rear-view mirror that told him more than any conversation could. On nights like this, the city felt like a book only he could read. And somewhere, deep in the next chapter, something was waiting to be written in blood. The rain in Athens didn't come often, but when it did, it arrived with a suddenness that made the streets glisten like liquid glass. That night in late 1996, the storm had passed, leaving puddles in the gutters and the smell of wet asphalt drifting through the open window of the taxi. Dimitris adjusted the rear-view mirror, watching the soft steam rise from the hood, and kept his hands loose on the wheel. It was nearing midnight when he saw her. A lone figure under a dim streetlight, one hand holding a bag, the other raised tentatively as he approached. She looked young, early 20s perhaps, her hair damp from the rain, her jacket clinging to her shoulders. Dimitris slowed the car and eased to the curb. "Where to?" he asked, his voice level, almost indifferent. She named a district on the city's outskirts, a quiet area past the last of the bus lines, where the roads narrowed and streetlights grew sparse. It was the kind of destination that most drivers hesitated to take at that hour. Dimitris simply nodded and pulled away from the curb, the wipers clicking in slow, steady arcs. The streets thinned as they left the city center. Storefronts gave way to low apartment blocks, then to stretches of road lined with skeletal trees. The woman sat in silence, looking out the window, her reflection blurred by droplets of water. Dimitris glanced at her in the mirror, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she fumbled with her bag. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was a more powerful tool than questions. Silence made people fill the space with their own thoughts, their own nervous explanations. And sometimes it told him more than words ever could. Half an hour later, they were deep into the outskirts. The streetlights had grown irregular, casting the road in broken patches of light and shadow. Dimitris turned onto a narrow lane lined with low stone walls. The woman shifted in her seat, glancing up at the road ahead. "Are we close?" she asked. "Yes," he said. His tone was calm, but his mind was elsewhere, on the subtle shifts in her breathing, the way she kept glancing behind them as if afraid of being followed. When they reached the address, she hesitated before opening the door. The street was empty, the air damp and still. She thanked him quickly, her voice low, and stepped out. Dimitris watched her walk up the path to a small, dimly lit building. She paused at the door, looking over her shoulder one last time. He didn't know then, or perhaps he did, in some instinctive way, that this wouldn't be the last time he saw her face. Back in his apartment later that night, Dimitris sat at the small kitchen table, a cigarette burning in the ashtray. The city outside was quiet, the rain having washed away the noise for a few hours. He thought of the passengers he had picked up that evening, but it was her image that stayed, hovering in the back of his mind. There was something about her, something that lingered like the smell of wet pavement. But in his life, people didn't stay. They appeared like shadows in the headlights, then vanished into the dark. And for Dimitris, the dark was always patient. Before the hum of the taxi engine became his constant companion, Dimitris Vakrinos lived in a different kind of noise. In the early 1980s, the shipyards of Piraeus were alive with the crackle of welding torches, the clang of steel plates, and the echo of boots on the cavernous floors. Dimitris was in his early 20s then, a lean young man with eyes that scanned more than they spoke, his hands steady even under the heat of the arc light. He had come to Athens seeking distance. Distance from the small mountain town in Arcadia where his childhood had been shaped by cold winters, a stern father, and the kind of lessons that leave marks you don't see in the mirror. Work in the shipyards was hard, but it was predictable. Sparks flew, seams closed, and the day ended with the whistle that sent men pouring into the streets like iron filings spilling from a barrel. But Dimitris was never entirely one of them. The others would drink together after shifts, shouting over the music in bars thick with cigarette smoke. He would stay for one drink at most, then slip away, walking the streets at night with his hands in his pockets, memorizing turns and alleyways like someone studying a language. He had a knack for remembering details. The bent sign above a side street, the way a certain light flickered over a corner shop, the shortcut through an unmarked lane that could cut minutes off a trip. It was a talent that would serve him later, though not in a way anyone could have guessed. By 1987, the welding job was gone. The shipyards had slowed, contracts dried up, and Dimitris was left with the city pressing in around him. That was the year he became a taxi driver. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and it gave him something he valued: the freedom to move, to drift through the city's veins at will. Behind the wheel, Dimitris found a kind of quiet power. The passengers came to him, climbed into his space, told him where to go. He controlled the route, the speed, the music, or lack of it. For most drivers, it was a job of endurance. Hours spent in traffic and endless conversations about the weather or football scores. But for Dimitris, it became something else, a way of watching, listening, learning. He noticed which passengers kept their hands in their pockets too long, which ones looked out the window instead of meeting his eyes in the mirror, which ones gave vague directions because they didn't want to be found later. Over time, he collected not just routes, but stories, not in full, just fragments, pieces that drifted into the air between the front and back seat. It was in those years that the shadows began to lengthen. He had always had a temper, a controlled, simmering kind that didn't flare easily, but burned hot when it did. Most of the time, it was hidden under layers of quiet and patience. But when he felt wronged, when someone crossed a line he believed should not be crossed, the anger came fast and without hesitation. The first incident wasn't in the papers. It happened one night when another driver cut him off and then laughed in his face at a traffic light. The argument spilled into the street, and though no one was seriously hurt, it left a mark in Dimitri's mind. It wasn't about the man's words. It was about the feeling, the sharp jolt of being mocked, dismissed, treated as small. That feeling didn't fade. By the early 1990s, Dimitris was known among a few fellow drivers as someone you didn't provoke without reason. He was quiet, yes, but there was an edge to that quiet. Like a knife kept in a drawer, rarely touched but always sharp. At home, he lived simply. A modest apartment, a handful of clothes, a radio, and a set of tools. But in his head, the city was a map without end, and he was always moving through it, noting the places where the light didn't reach, the roads that bent just enough to hide what happened there. Somewhere in those years, the line between observation and opportunity began to blur. And once blurred, it never truly returned to its place. It was the autumn of 1993 when Dimitris's life began to shift in a way that couldn't be undone. Athens was cooling after a long summer, and the nights had that crispness that made the air feel sharper in the lungs. The work was the same. Long hours behind the wheel, weaving through the city's endless arteries. But beneath the routine, something new was forming. That night began like any other. Dimitris was parked outside a small kiosk in Nea Smyrni, sipping bitter coffee from a paper cup, when a woman approached the taxi. She was in her mid-20s, wearing a heavy coat despite the mild weather, her hair tucked under a scarf. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning the street before she spoke. "Are you free?" she asked. He nodded and unlocked the door. She gave an address on the far edge of the city, a semi-rural road beyond the suburbs. It was a strange request for that hour, but Dimitris didn't question it. In this work, people had reasons they didn't want to explain. As they drove, the street lights grew sparse, replaced by the pale glow of the moon over empty lots. The woman fidgeted with her hands in her lap, glancing at the mirror now and then. Dimitris noted her unease but kept his gaze on the road. Halfway there, she asked if they could take a different route, a longer one that wound through a cluster of industrial buildings. He didn't reply immediately, just adjusted the wheel and followed the new path. Something in her voice had shifted, and his instincts, honed from years of reading passengers, told him this detour wasn't just about directions. When they reached the outskirts, the road narrowed to gravel. There were no houses in sight, just a row of abandoned warehouses, their windows like black, unblinking eyes. The woman told him to stop. "This is far enough," she said, her voice tight. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small roll of bills. Demetrius noticed the way her hands shook as she counted the money. He took it without a word, watching her step out into the dim light. She walked quickly toward the shadow of a warehouse, disappearing behind a rusted metal door. For a long moment, Demetrius sat in the idling taxi, the sound of the engine loud in the stillness. Something about the scene gnawed at him. The secrecy, the unease, the sense that whatever she was walking toward wasn't safety. But he didn't follow. He drove away, the tires crunching on the gravel until the darkness swallowed the place entirely. A week later, he heard about it. Not on the news. No, this kind of thing didn't make the front page. It came through whispers among drivers, the kind of stories traded at late-night coffee stands. A woman had been found near the outskirts, badly beaten. No one knew who did it. No one claimed to have seen anything. But as the story spread, a detail stuck with him. She had been last seen getting into a taxi. Demetrius never asked if anyone knew the driver's name. He didn't need to. He remembered the way she looked in the mirror, her eyes darting like a bird's. He remembered her detour through the empty warehouses. And though he told himself it had nothing to do with him, he also knew he hadn't forgotten her for a reason. That was the crack. The moment he began to realize that being behind the wheel didn't just make him a witness to the city's shadows. It could make him a part of them. Passengers trusted drivers in ways they didn't trust strangers on the street. They gave directions into the dark without thinking twice. And a driver, if he wanted, could choose not to take them exactly where they asked to go. It was a thought he didn't push away. In fact, it sat there in his mind, quiet and patient, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow. It was November 1993, a month after that strange night with the woman in the coat. The air in Athens had turned damp and heavy, the kind of weather that blurred the line between autumn and winter. Demetrius was working late, taking fares from the city center to the quieter districts. Near midnight, he stopped at a busy taxi rank in Omonia Square. The neon signs buzzed, reflecting off wet pavement, and the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart hung in the air. That's when she appeared. A different woman this time, but with the same nervous energy he'd seen before. Early 20s, slim build, long dark hair. She leaned into the passenger window. "Can you take me to Pellini?" she asked. Pellini was far, a suburb east of Athens, surrounded by open land and unfinished buildings. The route would be long and mostly deserted at this hour. Demetrius agreed, motioning for her to get in. They drove in silence for a while. She gave short answers to his questions, keeping her gaze fixed out the window. It didn't take long before they left the glow of the city behind. The road narrowed, bordered by fields and scattered street lamps. Halfway there, She asked him to turn onto a side road. It was unlit, lined with skeletal trees. Dimitri's knew it well. A service road used mostly by truckers and the occasional local who wanted to avoid the main highway. When he stopped, she opened her door, ready to step out. But something in him shifted. Maybe it was the way her voice had trembled. Maybe it was the way she had avoided his eyes in the mirror. Or maybe it was the thought that had been growing in his mind for weeks. The idea that here, on the edge of the city, no one was watching. He reached under his seat. The small jerry can he kept for emergencies was half full of petrol. He'd never thought of it as anything but a precaution. Until that moment. The next minutes were a blur of movement and heat. He stepped out into the cold air, the gravel crunching under his boots. She had turned to say something, maybe to thank him, maybe to ask for help. But his face was unreadable. The smell of petrol spread quickly, clinging to the damp air. When the match struck, the flame caught faster than he'd imagined. It roared up her coat, the light flaring against the black trees. She screamed, staggering backwards, her silhouette thrashing in the firelight. The night, once silent, was suddenly filled with the crackle of burning fabric and the high, panicked sound of her voice. Dimitri's stood still, his shadow cast long across the road. He didn't move until the flames began to fade into a smoldering, acrid smoke. Later, in the taxi, the heater humming quietly, he drove back toward the city. His hands were steady on the wheel. The smell of petrol lingered faintly, mixing with the distant sound of late-night radio. He didn't think about whether she would survive. He didn't think about the police, or the possibility of being recognized. What filled his mind instead was the strange calm that had settled over him. It wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was something colder, the feeling of having taken complete control of a moment. And once he knew he could do it, the road ahead no longer seemed the same. By January 1994, winter had settled fully over Athens. The air was sharp, and the mornings began in darkness. For taxi drivers, the season meant longer hours in the cold, more competition for fares, and tempers that frayed faster. That month, Dimitri's had been working the Monastiraki district, a tangle of narrow streets, small shops, and heavy foot traffic. It was a place where drivers often circled for long stretches, hoping to catch tourists or office workers in need of a ride. It was also where Dimitri's crossed paths with someone who would unknowingly seal his fate. Another taxi driver named Manolis. Manolis was older, loud, and quick with insults. They'd had small arguments before, over who saw a fare first, over parking spaces at busy ranks. That morning, the argument flared again. A young couple had waved for a taxi, and both men pulled toward them at the same time. "You cut me off," Manolis shouted through his open window. Dimitri's didn't answer. He stared ahead, jaw tight. Manolis pulled closer, his grin mocking. "Don't think you own the streets, little man." The words struck a familiar nerve, the same nerve that had twitched since childhood whenever someone tried to belittle him. Demetres drove off without replying, but the insult stayed with him. Through the rest of the shift, through the hours of winding through traffic, it burned in the back of his mind like a pilot flame. That night, as he drove home, Demetres saw Manolis's taxi parked alone outside a small diner in a quiet part of Neo's cosmos. The street was empty, the lamps casting pools of orange light. Demetres slowed, watching through the diner window as Manolis leaned over a table, laughing with another driver. He pulled over a short distance away and waited. 10 minutes later, Manolis stepped outside, lighting a cigarette before getting into his taxi. Demetres started his engine and eased forward, headlights low. Manolis turned onto a narrow side street lined with warehouses. There was no traffic, no pedestrians, just the sound of two engines in the cold air. Demetres closed the gap until his bumper nearly touched the other car. Manolis glanced in his mirror, frowning. That was when Demetres pulled alongside, rolling his window down. In the dim light, his expression was unreadable. He reached across the seat, gripping the small petrol can that still sat beneath it. The motion was quick, deliberate. A splash of liquid across the side of Manolis's taxi. Manolis barely had time to react before the flare of the match lit the space between them. Flames bloomed along the side of the car, racing toward the rear wheel. Manolis swerved hard, braking, the tires screaming against the pavement. Demetres drove on without looking back. In his mirror, the glow of fire flickered briefly, then disappeared behind the curve of the road. The next day, word spread among the taxi ranks. Manolis's car had been badly damaged in what the police described as a suspected arson incident. No one had been hurt, but the whispers began immediately. Drivers exchanged glances when Demetres passed. They didn't ask questions. In this business, you learned quickly not to. For Demetres, the incident confirmed something. The streets could be used to settle scores, and the taxi was more than a vehicle. It was a weapon, a tool, and a shield all in one. The line between work and vengeance had blurred, and once blurred, it stayed that way. By December 1995, 2 years had passed since the fire on the narrow street in Neo's cosmos. Demetres was still driving his taxi most nights, still weaving through the city's arteries with the same quiet, watchful presence. But by now, the edge to his temper had been sharpened by repetition. He had learned that grudges could be settled far from witnesses, that the city's shadows could hide anything if you knew where to place them. It was during this time that he crossed paths with the Karadimas brothers. The deal had seemed simple enough. Demetres owned an old sedan he no longer used, and the brothers, small-time mechanics with a reputation for cutting corners, offered to buy it for cash. The agreement was made quickly with little paperwork, and for a while it seemed the matter was done. But weeks later, word reached him that the brothers were telling people he'd sold them a worthless wreck, mocking him in public, claiming he'd cheated them by hiding faults in the car. The stories stung, not because they might ruin his business, but because they painted him as a fool. And Demetres was not a man who tolerated being made into a fool. He began to watch them. Not openly, never openly, but from a distance. He learned their habits, the times they left their small garage in the western suburbs, the cafe they visited most mornings, the winding road they took home each night. One cold evening, just after sunset, Dimitris parked his taxi at a quiet intersection near their route. He waited with the engine off, the city's noise replaced by the faint hum of distant traffic. When the brothers' battered pickup appeared, headlights bouncing over the uneven road, he pulled out behind them. At first, he followed at a distance. Then, as the road narrowed between two stretches of empty lots, he closed the gap. The brothers slowed, perhaps sensing they were being trailed. One of them leaned out the window to glance back, but the glare of Dimitris's headlights hit his face. In a sudden burst of speed, Dimitris pulled alongside. The window on the passenger side of the pickup was down. Without hesitation, he reached across his seat. Not for the petrol can this time, but for the heavy revolver he'd acquired months earlier from a man who owed him a favor. The first shot shattered the night air, echoing off the walls of the empty lots. The second came before the brothers had a chance to react. The truck swerved violently, skidding to a stop against the curb. Dimitris slowed, watching through the haze of exhaust as the cabin slumped into stillness. He didn't stay to confirm. The streets were silent, the air already swallowing the sound of gunfire. He drove on, blending back into the city's pulse as though nothing had happened. The next morning, the news spread quickly. 2 brothers found dead in their vehicle. No witnesses, no suspects. The police speculated about a gang dispute, perhaps a deal gone wrong. Among the taxi ranks, no one asked Dimitris where he'd been the night before. They didn't need to. For him, the act brought a different kind of calm than before. This wasn't the heat of a roadside fire, or the impulsive burst of anger over a petty slight. This was deliberate, methodical, a plan executed exactly as intended. And with that, something inside him shifted again. Killing was no longer an accident of temper. It was a solution. It was spring of 1996, the time of year when Athens shrugged off its winter chill and the air carried the faint smell of blooming orange trees. For most people, it was a season of longer days and easier moods. For Dimitris, it was simply another stretch of nights behind the wheel. Another season in which the city offered him both work and opportunity. He was driving through the northern district of Galatsi one evening, returning from a long fair. The roads there were quieter, winding uphill past apartment blocks and small shops closing for the night. It was just after 11 p.m. when a police patrol car appeared behind him, its lights flashing briefly before settling into a slow follow. Dimitris glanced in the mirror. 2 officers inside. Young. The kind who still spoke with the sharp confidence of men who believed they could bend the city to their will. He slowed and pulled to the side, as much out of curiosity as compliance. The officers approached, one to his window, the other standing just behind, hand resting casually on the grip of his sidearm. "License and registration," the first one said. His tone was flat, almost bored. Dimitris handed over the documents without expression. The officer flipped through them, then glanced at the back seat, where an empty plastic bag lay crumpled. "What's in the boot?" the second officer asked. "Tools," Dimitris said. "For work." They exchanged a quick look, then motioned for him to get out. Dimitris stepped onto the pavement, the cool air brushing against his face. He watched as one officer circled to the back of the taxi, opening the boot. The other stayed close, too close, his shadow overlapping Dimitris's own. Something in the officer's stance, the slight lean forward, the way his hand brushed the pistol grip, stirred a familiar heat in Dimitris's chest. It wasn't fear. It was the same feeling that had followed him since boyhood, whenever someone tried to box him in. When the officer at the boot made a remark, something about the state of his tools, muttered just loud enough to be heard. Dimitris's jaw tightened. The sound of the boot closing seemed louder than it should have been. The officer at his side smirked. "Drive safe," he said, as if dismissing a child. Dimitris got back into the taxi, but his pulse was steady in a way that didn't feel like calm. He watched them in the mirror as he pulled away, the patrol car still parked under the street lamp. He drove only a few blocks before turning off the main road, looping through side streets until he was behind them again. They didn't notice until the beam of his headlights stretched across their rear window. The road they were on wound uphill, flanked by trees and low stone walls. Quiet, secluded. Dimitris closed the gap. At the crest of the hill, he drew level with the patrol car. In the dim sodium light, the officers turned, confusion flashing across their faces. The revolver was already in his hand. The first shot punched through the passenger side window, spraying glass into the night air. The second found the driver before either man could react. The patrol car lurched sideways, rolling to a slow stop against the wall. The sound faded quickly. In its place came only the ticking of cooling metal and the faint rustle of leaves in the warm night air. Dimitris didn't linger. He backed away, his headlights fading into the maze of streets below. The incident made the news within hours. 2 officers attacked in an apparent ambush, no suspects named. The city buzzed with outrage, but Dimitris felt no stir of concern. He had moved in and out of the scene like a shadow, and the streets of Athens were full of shadows. By now, it wasn't about provocation. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about the certainty that he could act, against anyone, anywhere, and leave the night to swallow the evidence. By early 1997, Athens had begun to change. The city was more tense, the nights no longer carrying the same easy hum. In the taxi ranks, talk of assaults and killings had gone from whispers to open murmurs. No one mentioned Dimitris by name, but there was an unspoken awareness among the drivers. When certain incidents happened, he was always somewhere nearby. The police, too, had begun to see patterns. A string of unsolved attacks stretched back years, each one different in method, but united by their precision and the absence of witnesses. An arson here, a roadside shooting there. Victims from all walks of life. Passengers, fellow drivers, even police officers. The randomness made it harder to connect them, but not impossible. Dimitris didn't know it, but the noose was already tightening. One night in April 1997, he was idling near a taxi stand in central Athens when a man in his 30s approached. The man carried himself with the restless energy of someone used to watching over his shoulder. Peristeri, the man said, a district to the west. Dimitris nodded, unlocking the door. As they drove, the man talked idly about the weather, about the city's traffic, about nothing of importance. But something in his tone was off, too casual, like a conversation rehearsed. Halfway to Peristeri, the man asked if they could detour through a quieter street to pick something up. Dimitris agreed without hesitation. Quiet streets were nothing new to him. When they turned into the side road, another car appeared behind them. Its headlights stayed close, too close, and when Dimitris glanced in the mirror, he saw two silhouettes inside. His passenger sat back, silent now, his hands resting on his knees. The first flicker of suspicion passed through Dimitris's mind, but before he could act, the car behind flashed its high beams, and a voice barked from the passenger seat beside him. "Pull over." Police. It happened fast. Plainclothes officers swarmed the taxi, pulling open the doors, forcing him onto the cold pavement. His wrists were clamped in steel, the click of the cuffs echoing in the quiet street. A search of the taxi turned up the revolver, the petrol can, and other tools he had kept hidden for years. There was no outburst from him, no denial. He sat in the back of the police car, staring out at the darkened buildings sliding past. At the station, the questioning began. They started with the recent attacks, then moved further back. Each crime, each victim, a piece of a puzzle they were now laying out in front of him. They expected him to deny it, to fight. Instead, Dimitris began to talk. Over the next hours, he gave them a string of confessions. 5 murders, 7 attempted murders, and countless robberies. He spoke of them without drama, as if recounting the routes he'd driven that week. Each detail was precise. Locations, times, the order of events. The officers realized they were not just hearing a confession, but a map of violence drawn across years. When it was over, the lead investigator looked at him for a long moment and asked the question that had been hanging in the air since the beginning. Why? Dimitris didn't give a speech. He didn't offer a story of hardship or revenge. He only said, "Because I could." Korydallos Prison, May 1997. The walls here were high and colorless, the kind that swallowed the sky. The corridors smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale air, the voices of guards echoing off stone in clipped bursts. Dimitris Vakrinos had been here only a few weeks, but the rhythm of prison life was already familiar. The early counts, the clang of metal doors, the constant background hum of locked-in breathing. Since his arrest in April, the case had gripped Athens. The newspapers called him O Thymomenos Odigos Taxi, the angry taxi driver. Headlines ran with every detail of his confessions, each victim's name and the cold precision of his methods. On the outside, people demanded answers. On the inside, guards and inmates alike kept a watchful distance. He was not loud in prison, not threatening. He spent hours alone in his cell, sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, his gaze fixed on a patch of wall. To some, it looked like regret. To others, calculation. The trial was still months away. Prosecutors were gathering evidence, building a case that would almost certainly end with a life sentence. But Dimitris had no interest in the long parade of witnesses, the endless arguments over motive and sanity. He had given them his truth in the interrogation room. The rest, to him, was just noise. On the night of May 12th, the air in his cell was thick with the first heat of summer. He had eaten little at dinner. Around midnight, when the prison settled into its uneasy silence, Dimitris moved with a steady, unhurried precision. From under his mattress, he took the lace of his prison-issued shoes, thin, coarse, but strong enough for what he intended. He looped it over the iron frame of the bed, tying the knots without hesitation. There was no letter, no message, no last words for the guards who would find him. The act was as quiet and deliberate as the way he had stalked his victims on the streets of Athens. When they discovered him in the early hours, the lace taut, the body still, it was already over. In the days that followed, the newspapers printed his photograph alongside grainy images of the taxi he had once driven. Editorials debated whether his death was an escape from justice or the inevitable end of a man who had lived by his own rules. For the families of his victims there was no closure, only the cold fact that the trial would never come. On the streets of Athens, taxi drivers went back to circling the squares and waiting at the stands. The city's tide rolled on, as it always did, swallowing his name into the long list of its dark stories. And somewhere, in the memory of those who had crossed his path, Dimitris Vakrinos remained, the driver with the steady hands, the watchful eyes, and the roads that always seemed to lead into shadow. And so, our journey ends here, in a small cell on a warm night, with a single decision that closed a chapter forever. We have followed Dimitris Vakrinos from the quiet mountain town of his youth, through the restless streets of Athens, to the long, dark road that carried him into the heart of violence. He was a man who learned to watch before he acted, a man whose silence hid storms, a man who could turn an ordinary ride into the last anyone would take. Some say the city is a living thing, full of lights and voices and 1,000 hidden corners. But in the wrong hands, those corners can become traps, and the road home can turn into the road you never return from. You've been listening to Sleeping Radio. May your roads be safe, your nights quiet, and may you never find yourself in the back seat of a taxi whose driver has already decided where the journey will end.